Hello! In this video, we are going to be looking at Chapter 8, Photosynthesis. Get excited. In this video, we are going to be looking at this. You must know the summary equation, the source and the fate of the reactants and products, where are the reactants of this chemical reaction coming from, and what's the fate? Where are they going to end up? And then how leaf and chloroplast anatomy relate to photosynthesis. And we'll get into these videos, or these you must knows in the next video. So on your Unit 3 pacing guide, find the Chapter 8 Group Study Notes, GSN, and you're going to see this document. It is so helpful as you're going through this video. There's going to be a lot of terms and things to remember, and just writing down notes is helpful. But if you want to fill this out as you go, it can help you really understand the material better. So I highly recommend opening this up, working with your group if you have one, and filling this out to help you understand the content. All right, so as we learn about photosynthesis in this unit, I want you to remember as we are studying all the vocabulary and chemical reactions and steps, and it can be a little bit overwhelming, I want you to remember to pause and think about how this is connected to your life and why it's important. I remember when I was learning AP Bio in high school, I remember especially when I got to this chapter on photosynthesis, I remember there was a lot of details. But I remember one day just taking a little walk after studying and looking up at the trees around me and noticing that at one point when I had looked at trees, I had seen them differently than I did now, that I had learned all the intricacies of what's going on inside the plant cells to do photosynthesis. This is the reason why we have life on Earth. Plants have this magical, it seems, ability to capture sunlight and convert it into energy that can be used on the planet for everything. And so as you are watching this video, I want to encourage you to find curiosity, find awe, find wonder in the beauty of science and the beauty of life and our planet. And as you are going outside and you're looking at the trees, think back to what you're learning in this video. And I hope that you can be inspired today as you know more about the world. And I hope you feel empowered. You get a sneak peek in behind the scenes at what is happening for life to occur on Earth. And that's a beautiful thing. So I want you to embrace that as you are watching this video. And if your mind becomes overwhelmed, come back to the beauty of this process. So we're learning about photosynthesis. Photosynthesis doesn't just happen in plants. It happens in some bacteria, algae, and even protists, unicellular protists. These are like amoebas that swim in lakes and rivers. We are talking about photosynthesis, and I want you to spend just a quick moment thinking back to when you learned photosynthesis in middle school or ninth grade when you took biology, and think about what you recall. Hopefully, take a second, think about it. Hopefully, you remember something like this, something about this equation. Overall, the summary equation of photosynthesis is a plant is going to take in some ingredients, some reactants on the left-hand side, some carbon dioxide, and some water. These are reactants that are floating around in the air as gas or in the roots as water, liquid water. And there's going to be some sort of chemical reaction. These molecules are going to be broken apart and rebuilt into glucose and oxygen. Glucose is a sugar, right? C6H12O6. We remember this from cellular respiration. This is a molecule that's now holding a bunch of chemical energy in its bonds. And we've got some glucose here, or some oxygen here. And this reaction is endergonic. It's not exergonic. It's not releasing energy. It's pulling in energy. It needs energy to happen. And it's an anabolic reaction, anabolism. We're building molecules here using energy from the sun. You might also remember this kind of model from when you learned photosynthesis in the past. Here's you have your plant inside our plant cells. You have carbon dioxide coming in, solar energy coming in, and oxygen being created. Now, also some water is being created through cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is also happening in the leaves of this plant. You have sugars being made. These sugars are transported down to the roots where they're stored. And later on, those sugars can be broken down to get energy, to get ATP using cellular respiration. But the plant basically is taking in energy from the sun, storing it in chemical energy in the bonds of glucose or sugar. And it's taking that glucose and it can chop it up and break it up and oxidize it and make ATP. Or it can take that sugar and basically put it in a long chain called starch and it can store the starch in the roots, right? That's why, where do potatoes grow? They grow in the roots because potatoes are made up of a bunch of starch molecules, and starch is a polysaccharide. It's a bunch of monosaccharides, a bunch of sugars on a long chain. Basically, think those potatoes as like bank accounts. They're storing up sugar so that when the plant needs energy later, it can take that polysaccharide, it can break it up, it can hydrolyze it, and it can now do cellular respiration and harvest chemical energy, ATP, from that high energy sugar molecule, right? We also need some elements, some nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other nutrients come up through the roots. These are like vitamins. They're not energy for the plant, but they're helping the plant stay healthy, like when you take vitamins. And the plant transports water, some oxygen from the roots up to the leaves, and the leaves will create more glucose and also do cellular respiration to get energy. All right. Now, we know that all life needs energy in order to live. Heterotrophs, you and I, get energy from eating others. Hetero means other, troph means food. So we get food from eating other things. We consume other organisms. We consume organic molecules like fats, like proteins, and carbohydrates by eating other things that are living. Autotrophs, auto means self, troph means food, get energy from themselves. They use the energy from sunlight to synthesize, to create their own organic molecules that they will then break down using cellular respiration to get ATP. How are they connected? Heterotrophs, you and I, we can't make our own food. So we take in glucose, we take in sugar, and we breathe in oxygen and we break them down, right? This is catabolism. We're breaking down the molecule, we're getting energy from it. This is an exergonic reaction, we're releasing energy, and we're creating carbon dioxide and water, right? We are oxidizing glucose. We're pulling off those hydrogens from glucose, and we are creating ATP through the process, and we're reducing our oxygen, and we're making water. Autotrophs, they basically take their ingredients from the air, from the roots, carbon dioxide and water, and energy is needed. This is an endergonic reaction. We're requiring energy, and we're taking that energy and we're converting it into a type of energy that can be stored for later, right? We're taking light energy, we're storing it as chemical energy in the bonds of glucose, and we're making oxygen as a product. Now, this chemical reaction is also a redox reaction, just like we saw in cellular respiration. Remember, redox reactions is when you have a molecule is reduced. Reduced, remember oil rig, reduction is gain. So carbon dioxide, you'll notice, is now gaining some hydrogens. Where did it get those hydrogens from? It got it from H2O. So H2O becomes oxidized. Those hydrogens are going to get pulled off, and they are going to eventually end up on this glucose molecule. And we know that light is required to power this endergonic reaction. This is requiring energy because we're building up a higher energy molecule. All right, so again, how are these connected? Photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and water, energy from the sun, and produces glucose and some oxygen as a byproduct. Then the plants themselves will take their own glucose and some oxygen from the air, and they will oxidize their glucose, pull off those hydrogens, those energy carrying molecules, those electrons, and create ATP that can be used in the cell. Also, animals do this. So if we were to eat plants or we were to eat meat, basically meat comes from animals that ate plants at one point, like a cow eats plants, we eat the cow, and we get glucose in our body. We take those glucose molecules and we break them down to make ATP, and then plants produce carbon dioxide and water as a waste product, and that will now go to power photosynthesis. So there's a common misconception. Sometimes people say, well, plants release oxygen and take in carbon dioxide, right? But plants also release carbon dioxide in cellular respiration. We humans, we take in oxygen and we release carbon dioxide because we can't do photosynthesis. We can only do cellular respiration. But plants can do both. They're special. All right, so here's kind of like a summary slide that I just talked about. If you want to pause, you can take a look. But the key thing I want to show you here is that plants collect energy from the sun and they store it. So when they're creating molecules of glucose and then they're creating long chains of carbohydrates, of polysaccharides, they're storing their energy in a form that can be used later. So they take the glucose molecule, they send those glucose molecules down to their roots, And later on, if they want to, they can chop up that molecule of carbohydrate, that long polysaccharide, and they can use that high energy molecule to go through cellular respiration to make a bunch of ATP when they need it most. Here is a look at the plant structure. So plants get their energy from the sun through their leaves. So leaves have, we'll talk about this in a moment, have the special ability to capture light. Carbon dioxide enters through little pores in the surface of a leaf called stomata. This is where gas, air, carbon dioxide is coming in. Water comes up through the roots. Also, water can come up through the stomata as well. There are openings and there's water vapor in the air that can be pulled in. And then nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen are needed to build other molecules can come up. Remember how we talked about how when the plant does photosynthesis, it creates glucose, and it can store those glucose molecules in long chains as starch. They store those in, like down here in the roots, right here, right? So here's our potatoes, or even in fruits or vegetables. Here we have tomatoes here that are storing starch. So that's why when you eat potatoes, when you eat vegetables, you're eating starch, because starch comes from sugar molecules that are connected in a long chain. The plant uses these for a rainy day. It's like their storage account. It's like their bank account where they can pull out when they need it. When we eat the food, we benefit too because we get sugars. Okay, now let's look closely at what would happen if you were to take your body and shrink yourselves down and go into a leaf. So we're kind of taking a tour inside a leaf. So if you were to go inside and you were to look inside a leaf, you see a bunch of cells called mesophyll cells. That's not important for you to know. But inside the mesophyll cells, you will see chloroplasts. Chloroplasts look like this. They're organelles. And each mesophyll cell has about 30 to 40 chloroplasts each. So in one cell, you have 30 to 40 of these chloroplasts, is special organelle. Now, notice here in the leaf, you have these little pores, these stomata, where there's gas exchange. So carbon dioxide comes in, oxygen comes out. Also, oxygen needs to come in as well for cellular respiration. So this picture is a little misleading, but this also happens too. Okay, and then inside the chloroplast, you'll notice that there are little pancakes here. These pancakes are called thylakoids. And each thylakoid is stacked up in kind of like a stack of pancakes that makes a single granum. So one of these is a granum, multiple of them are called grana. And this is where photosynthesis happens, inside this chloroplast, this organelle, inside the cell in the leaf. Okay. Now, these thylakoids are basically a bunch of membranes. They're a bunch of membranes. And what do we know about membranes? Every time you think about membranes, think increasing surface area. So there's so many membranes here. There's so much surface here for things to happen. And just like we saw in cellular respiration, in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, we know that there are proteins that are basically creating ATP, right? ATP synthase is synthesizing ATP. So we're going to come back to these membranes, and we're going to find that we can also find some ATP synthase in here where we can make some ATP. So I think we'll come back to this membrane thing. In the thylakoid, there's a membrane. We have a special molecule called chlorophyll. Now, chlorophyll, we'll come back to in a second, is a molecule that can absorb energy from the sun. So this right here in the thylakoid, this is where the plant is absorbing energy. And we'll come back to this, but the electron transport chain, there's another one in this. We're going to come back to it. Basically, within the thylakoid space, the thylakoid sac here, we are going to build up a bunch of protons, and we're going to build up a gradient, and we'll come back to that. We're going to make some ATP here. So we'll come back to all that, just kind of an intro. So just like we saw here, so inside this little thylakoid, inside we're going to build up a bunch of H pluses. And what do we know about increasing the concentration of hydrogen ions? Ooh, they're going to diffuse down the concentration gradient. So they're going to go from inside the thylakoid eventually out into the space outside called the stroma. The stroma is the space outside of the thylakoids. And we're going to find some ATP synthase there where we're going to be making more ATP. If that's kind of confusing to you, go back to the video on cellular respiration. We'll also cover it again in this video. All right, now we talked about the structure of a chloroplast. Let's talk a little bit about light. So light is also important. This is kind of some background info you need to know before we get into like the details of photosynthesis. So light travels from the sun in wavelengths. And light is captured by pigment molecules that are found in the thylakoid. So if you look closely at a thylakoid, you would see a membrane. here's our phospholipid bilayer. So here's our hydrophilic heads and our hydrophobic tails, a bilayer, 2 layers. And embedded, you have a cluster of these molecules called pigments embedded in these thylakoid membranes. So remember, this green part, right? This is kind of looks like a fruit gusher. The surface outside of the membrane, it looks like this. You have these pigment molecules. If you were to look closely at a pigment molecule, it looks like this. It's a bunch of carbons bonded together, some nitrogens, some oxygens down here, a bunch of hydrocarbon chains down here. And in the center, you have an atom called magnesium. Now, there are different types of pigment molecules, and the type that is found in the thylakoid membrane is called chlorophyll. Now, if you change the shape of chlorophyll, so right here at this spot, if you have CH3, that's a molecule called chlorophyll A. If you have CHO right here, it's called chlorophyll B. So just a small change changes the type of pigment molecule. We'll talk about why that's important in a second, but there's different types of molecules based on the molecular structure of the molecule. Now, why does this structure make sense? So you have this long hydrocarbon tail. So these are carbons here. It's a long chain of carbons and hydrogens. Even though they're not shown, the scientists get a little lazy. Why is this important? Well, remember, we're embedding this molecule in the cell membrane. We know that the bottom here, in the inside of the cell membrane, is very hydrophobic, right? The fatty acid tails are a bunch of hydrocarbon chains, carbon-hydrogen chains. And this can easily fit in the hydrophobic membrane. And this part, magnesium, has a charge on it. This is polar side, so it can be on the top right in this polar side, the hydrophilic side of the membrane. Everything's connected in this class. Hopefully you're seeing that. All right, now each of these pigment molecules doesn't just work on its own. It works with a group of pigment molecules called a photosystem. We'll take a look at that in a second. All right, now we just talked about this. Our chloroplasts here are found inside the plant cells. And here's a closer look. So here's a chloroplast. It has a double membrane. Remember how in our endosymbiotic theory we learned about how chloroplasts are hypothesized to have once been their own prokaryotic cells, which got engulfed by another prokaryote, and now it has a double membrane, its own original membrane, and then the outer membrane of the organism that engulfed it. So it's double membrane here. Chloroplasts actually have their own DNA. They have their own ribosomes. They're able to self-replicate. They can make copies of themselves. So they kind of act like their own prokaryotic cell living within a eukaryotic cell. Now, what makes chloroplasts special? Well, they actually have pigment molecules, right? So we saw these pigments are embedded in the membranes of the thylakoids, and they have the ability to absorb light. Okay, pigment molecules absorb light. Now, different pigment molecules can absorb different wavelengths of light. Okay, so for plants actually have the ability to absorb white light from the sun. So all the wavelengths of light, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, are traveling as white light when they're combined. But when they hit the chlorophyll, the pigment molecule will absorb the red wavelengths, the orange, the yellow, the blue, the purple, and they will reflect the green wavelengths. So that's why we see green when we see a plant, is because the plant reflects green light to our eyes and absorbs all the other wavelength colors. All right, now if we look here, we can look at this called the light spectrum. Okay, now we see different measurements here. When we're talking about energy, we're talking about wavelengths, and we have different types of wavelengths. So, for example, really, really small wavelengths, you're talking about wavelengths that are really small. Basically, if you've taken any sort of physics class, or if you remember this from middle school, we have the trough here is the bottom of the wavelength, and the crest here, the top of the wavelength. Now, notice that there is a certain distance here between one crest and one crest here. So the distance here. Now, if I were, sorry, my drawing's not amazing. If I were to look at really big wavelengths, radio waves over here, they have much bigger wavelengths. A wavelength is a distance from here to here. Notice comparing to this one's much longer, right? So radio waves, microwaves have really long wavelengths. Gamma rays, X-rays, UV light rays have really, really small wavelengths. Now, there's a portion of the light spectrum called visible light. Okay, and if you're measuring in a unit called nanometers, and the visible light spectrum ranges from 380 nanometers to 750. What does that mean? It's the measurement from here to here of a wavelength. So if you were to measure a wave from here to here, and you took a ruler, you can't do this with a real ruler, it's too small, but you measured 380 nanometers, that's a wavelength in the visible light spectrum that is purple light. Okay, so if a wavelength that's 380 meters hits a pigment molecule and gets reflected, you would see purple light, right? So for example, let's see, this post-it, let's use a different example. Let's use, let me see. Let's see, okay, this purple marker. Okay, right now there's white light that's hitting the marker, visible light, and it's traveling at a certain wavelength. And there are pigment molecules within this marker, and these pigment molecules are absorbing all the wavelengths. So they're absorbing green, they're absorbing the red, they're absorbing the yellow, the blue, and they're reflecting to my eye the purple wavelengths. So that's what I can see when I see this purple. Now, the shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy. So these wavelengths here, gamma rays, X-rays, UV rays, have more energy compared to the longer wavelengths that have lower amounts of energy. Now, if you were to take if you were to take some microwaves and you were to put your plant next to a microwave, the microwaves would not give your plant energy to do photosynthesis. Plants cannot absorb microwaves to do photosynthesis. Plants have pigment molecules that can only absorb wavelengths in this region, right, in this part of the spectrum. So only these wavelengths can the plants absorb to do photosynthesis. If we think back to our chlorophyll molecule, our pigment molecule here, remember pigments, their job is to absorb energy, absorb sunlight, solar energy, but they also reflect some energy. Reflect means the energy bounces off, the sunlight bounces off. And certain wavelengths of light can be absorbed or reflected. Now, we can use this graph. It looks a little scary at first. We can use this graph to kind of see what kinds of chlorophyll molecules or even other pigment molecules inside a leaf can absorb certain wavelengths. So let's take a close look at this graph down here. We see the visible light spectrum. So 400 nanometers, right? These are really, really small wavelengths, really high energy. Here is 700 nanometers. This is like red wavelengths. Remember, when we're talking about wavelengths, we're literally talking about the distance between the crests of those wavelengths from one to another. Remember, so I showed you here. So this is a wavelength. And you can't see this, but it's how the energy is traveling. So from here to here, that's the wavelength, right? And so we have really, really small wavelengths down here at this part of the visible light spectrum. And notice on the y-axis, we are graphing absorbance of light by chloroplast pigments. So we're looking at how much is absorbed, okay? So if this is my pigment right here, this is my chlorophyll molecule, right? And we look at this part of the visible light spectrum. We look at 400. Let's look at right here, like 430 maybe. We're going to just look at this line here, chlorophyll A. This is one type of chlorophyll molecule. Is the light being really absorbed or not? Well, it's being really absorbed. So if we were to take purple light, purple wavelength, right? Remember, it's really high wavelength or low wavelength, really small, really high energy. And it were to hit, that purple wavelength would get absorbed, right? So it's showing how much is absorbed. Let's look at blue. Let's see if blue, so blue is a little bit longer wavelength. If it goes close, does it get absorbed or reflected? Notice that it's not really absorbed here, so it gets reflected off. Okay, and then what happens if we get some green wavelengths? So green wavelengths are a little bit longer. I'm gonna drop them over here, so a little bit longer wavelengths. When it hits the chlorophyll molecule, this pigment right here, is anything absorbed? No, there's low absorbance. Absorbance means it goes in, it stays in. It's all reflected, so green is reflected off. Let's go over here to yellow. We have yellow light. Yellow is even longer wavelengths. Ooh. If yellow hits the chlorophyll molecule, the pigment, is it absorbed? No, it's not absorbed. So it's reflected off. Let's go to, we're still looking at this dark green. Let's go to like red. If we were to get red, red's really long wavelengths, the lowest amount of energy. And we were to look here, we would see that there's a lot of absorbance, so there's not as much reflection. Now, in our eyes, if our eyes right here, we would see the plant has kind of like a bluish, greenish yellow. So these colors will mix, and that's what we'll see when we see the plant. Now, this is just one chlorophyll molecule. There are other types of chlorophyll that can absorb different wavelengths. So you'll also have in the plant another chlorophyll molecule over here that is absorbing wavelengths in different parts of the spectrum. So if we look at like 450 nanometers, so like the blue wavelengths, those wavelengths are being absorbed by this pigment molecule here. So that's why you don't really see blue when you look at plants, because the blue wavelengths, even though they're hitting this one and reflecting here, when the blue wavelengths are hitting this chlorophyll molecule, this different molecule, mosquito, they're absorbing that one. So it's not as reflecting as much. Even you have pigments called, you have pigments called carotenoids. Carotenoids kind of sound like carrots, and carotenoids absorb or reflect red and orange light. So if you were to look at this pigment here, so this yellow line, you would notice that the blue light here is being absorbed. So blue light is absorbed. But if you were to look down here at like the green and the yellow, that's not being absorbed, it's being reflected off. Same here. But then if you look over here, especially over here in our red and orange, there's not much absorption. So if orange light were to hit the carotenoid pigment, it would be reflected. Red light were to hit the carotenoid pigment, notice here that the yellow line, there's no absorbance, so that would be reflected as well. And so that's why the carotenoid pigment is absorbing these wavelengths. Now, if you were to combine basically all of these, notice here that these three pigment molecules take care of most of this light. So they're absorbing these colors. So you don't really see purple, blue leaves because all those wavelengths are getting absorbed. And then notice here, you don't really see often red or orange wavelengths. But there are red or orange leaves. But there is certain times of the year where you would see these red or orange leaves, and that is during the fall. Chlorophyll molecules, remember our chlorophyll is found in the thylakoid membranes of our chloroplasts. The chlorophyll A and the chlorophyll B, the pigment molecules that absorb most of the light and reflect green light, are the most abundant in leaves. There's most of them. But in the winter months, what happens is the tree prepares for winter. It doesn't need to do as much photosynthesis because there's not as much sunlight. So the tree is going to go in kind of like hibernation mode. They're not going to want to do as much photosynthesis. Thankfully, they've stored up enough starch in their roots, in their potatoes, in their vegetables, so they can have enough energy for the winter. Because they're going to kind of shut down their leaves. Their leaves are going to go. They're going to stop. And so what happens is they break down their own chlorophyll. So they break down their light absorbing pigments. But what they don't break down is the carotenoid pigments. So the carotenoid pigments are left over, and the carotenoid pigments are absorbing the wavelengths and reflecting red and orange and yellow wavelengths. So that's why you see different colors in the fall. As the temperature changes, the chlorophyll green pigment molecules are going to be broken down, and all you have left is the carotenoids. And eventually the trees will lose their leaves, or they will turn brown, because now you're basically breaking down all your pigment molecules. You're halting photosynthesis for the season. All right, so we just talked about this, but I kind of go over the text here. So photosynthesis only absorbs energy from the absorbed wavelengths. So whatever wavelengths are absorbed is the light that's going to be used to power the reaction of photosynthesis. Chlorophyll A is the dominant pigment in plants, and this is the pigment that reflects green light and absorbs other wavelengths. Chlorophyll A right here, so it absorbs purple light and blue light, reflects green and yellow, and absorbs red and orange light. So basically, when you're looking at chlorophyll, you're looking at green because this part is being reflected off. Okay, we talked about that. And we're going to pause here. In our next video, we'll talk all about what actually is happening in the reaction of photosynthesis.